Say okay, and then we're on. Hi, everybody. My name is Jim Craig. I am the president of the Veteran Studies Association. I'm excited that you're here. Thank you for coming to the first of our fall 2024 Colloquia series in Veteran Studies. Let me check my notes right here. So if you don't know or you're not a member, the Veteran Studies Association promotes and publishes rigorous scholarship about critical issues shaping veterans' experiences of any country and any historical era to enhance public understanding, teaching, service, and advocacy. That's a lot of words to tell you that we care deeply about the veterans and the veteran experience writ large. And we'd like to share that with ourselves and with each other. One of the best ways we do that is this series, this open series called Veteran Studies Colloquia. So today is the first of them. We have two more scheduled and more on the way. So keep your eyes peeled for more speakers coming. And with that, I think I'm going to pass it to Corinne, who's going to introduce our speaker.
Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Corinne Hinton. I'm Secretary of the Veteran Studies Association and Chair of the Publications and Research Committee. It's my pleasure to introduce you all to our first fall colloquium speaker, David Eisler. David is the Editorial Director for Language, Literature, and Culture for the international academic publisher De Gruyter Brill, based in Germany. In 2021, he earned a PhD in Literary and Cultural Studies at the Heidelberg Center for American Studies, with a dissertation on civil military relations in American war fiction, which he then published as Writing Wars, Authorship in American War Fiction, World War I to Present with the University of Iowa Press in 2022. Prior to his doctoral studies, David spent 3 years as a research analyst with the Institute for Defense Analyses near Washington, D.C. He also received a bachelor's degree in astrophysics from Cornell in 2007 and a master's in international affairs from Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs in 2014. And finally, I'm honored to say that David and the book on which he is presenting today won the first Senators Bob and Elizabeth Dole Biennial Award for Distinguished Book in Veteran Studies, which we awarded to him at the 2024 Veterans in Society Conference. Welcome, David, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. It's nice to be here, even if it's virtually. It's good to see a lot of familiar faces, people that I've met over the years. Randy, good to see you there. It's been a while. We were just talking a few minutes ago about I guess it was 2018 War Literature and the Arts Conference in Colorado. So it's been a while when you think about that. And it's nice to have a chance to talk about this project in greater detail than I had the chance to back in, what was that, March at the conference. So yeah, really, really honored to have the chance to do this. And I am going to do my best to figure out how to do this digitally. Like, I've done this presentation in person a few times. I've got slides, I've got words. I don't know how they're going to mix and match, but I'll try to get through them as best as I can. So yeah. Thank you very much for having me today. Oh my God, it does work. Sorry, pardon my Ludditism where I switch my mouse from one side to the other and it actually scrolls and does things. That's so cool. Very unprofessional, but whatever. Here we go. I wanted to start by giving a bit of an idea of the genesis of where this project came from. The idea started with a couple of observations that I had while researching potential ideas for a PhD project at this point many years ago. And it started by noticing that Vietnam and the draft had been contentious topics in American culture since essentially the 1960s. But the draft was abolished in 1973, and since that point, only volunteers have served in the United States military. But wars haven't stopped, and nor have novels about this war stopped, and I had read a number of them at the time. So I began this work interested in the following question, which you see here, which is how did the end of the draft influence the cultural production of American war fiction? There was a number of observations that started with this, which was the first couple of novels that I read from about the war were written by non-veterans, and I thought that was kind of strange at some point. So I actually went to a deceptively even simpler question, which is just who writes novels about war? Ordinarily, when I've done this presentation in person, I like to make this next slide really interactive, but I don't think it's going to quite work the way I'd want to here. So I'm just going to show it to you, which is essentially, here's some pictures of some people who've written war novels. Or you can ask yourself, do you know who they all are? I like to kind of do it as a quiz. If anybody gets 5 out of 5, no one has ever gotten 5 out of 5, and for good reason. But I don't think I'm not going to take hands or anything like that. I don't think it quite works here. Upper left corner is John Dos Passos, which you may recognize from the only picture of him that is ever presented anywhere. In the middle, Ernest Hemingway, freshly wounded during his time as an ambulance driver during the First World War. Top right, you probably know this one, J.D. Salinger. I think this was one that is allegedly taken in the Hedgerow area of Normandy during World War II post D-Day while he was writing Catcher in the Rye. That's apocryphal, I think. And then the bottom two are kind of more interesting, right? So bottom left, so this very dashing woman from the late 19, no, when she is here, late 19th century, early 20th century. That's Willa Cather. And then the bottom right, this sweet grandmother lady looking, who you wouldn't expect to be a war novel writer. That's Bobby Ann Mason, who wrote the 1985 Vietnam novel In Country, which is essentially, in my opinion, the one that changed this entire trend away from only soldiers writing about war to opening it up to other people. So we can ask this question when we look at a number of the titles that have been published about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Who writes novels about war? And for nearly a century after the First World War, the answer was very simple. It was soldiers who had been there. The assumption that a person must have experienced war in the flesh to write about it in fiction was taken for granted by writers, reviewers, critics, and even scholars. And the veteran author's authority was rarely challenged, having become embedded into the fabric of the genre's convention. If there were war stories to tell, veterans would tell them. Since the Civil War, veterans have relied on military credentials as a testament to their narrative authority, this idea that they have shouldered the burden of experience and thus earned the right to write about it. But when you think about it, for a nation whose most recent encounter with sustained conflict on home soil ended in 1865, the introduction of geographic distance between the battlefield and what became known as the home front spilled into the field of cultural production. American civilians safely ensconced between two oceans were spared the horrors and devastations of bombs and bullets, allowing the veterans-turned authors to enter the literary field with a ready-made banner of symbolic capital that publishers gladly waved to a readership eager for the truth of what it must have been like over there. This trend began after World War I and eventually became enshrined in the American cultural landscape, this war at a distance mentality that views wartime service with a combination of respectful fear on one side and reluctant awe on the other. But something has actually changed a lot since 2001, and I would argue even a little bit further, which let's start with just this graph. It's a quantitative picture of American written and published novels published about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. This ends in 2020 when I stopped doing the work for it, but I guess that things haven't really changed that much since, but the numbers have probably changed a little bit. And to give you an idea, so through 2020, there were 67 novels that I found published by 59 individual authors. And of these, 23 of them were veterans, 31 were non-veterans, and 5 were in this category as experience in country, but not as uniformed soldiers. So I call them non-military observers. These are people who can credibly claim the authority of personal experience, but without direct connection to the military. And another big important number here is that more than 1/3 of the 59 authors, 20 of them, are women. I'll come back to this graph again in a little bit, but I show it now to demonstrate that this picture of the male veteran turned author is not quite so accurate. And the project, what I ended up doing here is the story of how veteran authors came to monopolize the cultural authority over the literary representation of war in the 20th century, but how they have ceded that authority for the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, in my opinion, and particularly in response to the changes in the relationship between the military and society. This is the basic idea. It's kind of a historical overview that starts with the First World War and ends with the ends of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. One could argue that these ideas of the forever wars, when I was writing, the forever war concept was still very much on the tip of everyone's tongue. I haven't heard it talked about quite as much lately in the last few years for, I suppose, a variety of reasons, but nonetheless, there are still texts being written about this and novels being published about them. And I think there still will continue to be going on forward. So what I want to do is essentially give a quick overview of the evolution of this concept of literary authority during and after the World Wars before we get to Vietnam. And it starts in 1920, where by 1920, war fiction was not a well-developed genre in American literature. And even though literary historians refer to 1929, which is the year that Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls was published, as well as All Quiet on the Western Front, that's the year referred to as the war books boom. If you actually look at the numbers, which I did, you find that the First World War was a frequent theme in American literature in the years before that. So between 1914 and 1920, there were 133 American authors, 52 women, 81 men, who published 164 novels about the war. And what's fascinating about these novels, and I didn't read them all, but I did count them. There's a couple of annotated bibliographies out there. And when I did this, I didn't know anything about AI, and no one was talking about this back in like 2017. Maybe somebody could have done this faster than me, but I did it manually, which I don't recommend, but it's done. So there it is. It's for everybody to enjoy now. But yeah, so the novels that were written at this time were essentially incorporating the war into existing literary structures and genres. So they were writing sentimental love stories, heroic action-adventure stories, and they adhered to the conventions of their genres. And what's fascinating is that these works were judged, when you read reviews about them, according to their aesthetic merits and not investigated for their authenticity. Another one of those concepts that comes up over and over again in this. With this huge spike that comes in the first part, and you see on the graph here, the blue line is the non-veteran authored novels, and then the green line is veteran authored novels. And the war books boom you can see in 1929 is like a tiny spike compared to what was written before that. And what's fascinating is that few of the authors that I mentioned, the 133 American authors between 1914 and 1920, only 17 of them had personally experienced the war in some capacity. 10 of them had served in the military, and 7 had experienced the war as either journalists or civilians. And if an author with personal experience published a novel about the war, it was more of a novelty than an expectation of authenticity. The literary critics focused far more on the novel's style and content than the author's biography. But then, the publication of John Dos Passos' novel Three Soldiers in 1921 changed this almost overnight. Dos Passos was the first American war veteran who wrote a novel that broke free from the genre's previous conventions. He was a new kind of author, this veteran author whose subject was a completely different kind of war that had been unknown to humankind at that point. And critics had no idea how to deal with this literary reality. They read it and they couldn't quite figure out how to assess it. So they looked at authenticity as the dominant theme of aesthetic appreciation. Is it good? Wasn't really a question. It was more, is it true? And without obvious tools to assess a concept like authenticity in literary terms, personal experience with the subject became a very easy reference point. And the comparison here is 1 year later, the respected author, Willa Cather, published her own novel about the war. It's called One of Ours. If you haven't read it, it's fascinating. I can't recommend it enough. It's really, really interesting. It has more in common with, I think, the types of novels that we read about the wars today than it did with what was around it at the time. And that's why literary critics judged her novel so harshly against these new standards of authenticity. The reviews were condescending and chauvinistic. There were like Hemingway tore it apart. He talked about the war scenes being catheterized in that she basically took them from movies and then wrote them from what she had seen in movies. The reviews that were written, and it was reviewed very widely. They had titles like Miss Cather Goes to War, and there's even one line in one of the reviews that says that she should stick to her farms and farmer folk rather than write about some big men's subject like war. So this comparison here is utterly fascinating, and I go into it in great depth in the actual book. But just to give you a sense of it and a feeling for it, they couldn't have been more different from each other, the two authors. You had the 25-year-old John Dos Passos, who was essentially unknown. He had been trying to write. He'd written something before Three Soldiers that didn't get anywhere. Nobody really cared. When the book was published, it didn't sell very well. It didn't win any prizes. The elite literary critics, though, when I say elite critics, I mean the ones who had a lot of influence within the field at the time. H.L. Mencken and a few others whose names are familiar if you've kind of looked into literary history at the time. They loved it. They said, oh my gosh, this guy is criticizing the military. No one else is doing that. This is fantastic. It must be great. But amateurs who read it didn't like it at all. And a lot of former soldiers wrote in to basically say that Dos Passos's understanding and experience of the military did not represent what they had experienced during their time in service. And even more fascinating was that there were even some veterans who wrote reviews of the book who criticized him for not having had enough experience. They're like, oh, this guy's just an ambulance driver who experienced a little bit of combat, but it wasn't really enough. He doesn't really know what he's talking about. Meanwhile, Willa Cather's one of ours. This was not her first novel. She had written several others, kind of Midwestern focused, Americana type stuff, very influenced by 19th century, early 20th century writing style. And it was a bestseller. It was read all over the place. It won the 1922 or 1923 Pulitzer Prize. But the reception from these critics, the same ones in many cases who had reviewed Dos Passos, they just ripped it apart for a lot of different reasons. But amateurs loved it because everybody who read it could find something in it that they felt represented their experiences. What's really fascinating is this underlying thread in the Cather reviews that discredited her interpretation of the war by insinuating that a woman had no perspective from which she could properly assess the situation. And this theme gets brought up over and over again. The result of this is that the war novel becomes its own genre. And years later, you've probably run into this if you've studied some of these things. Paul Fussell is sort of inescapable when it comes to American war literature. But another scholar named James Campbell had introduced the term combat Gnosticism to describe this attitude toward war literature in which only direct experience could provide the knowledge and therefore the necessary authority to write about war. And in that sense, Willa Cather never stood a chance. Although she had, in fact, in her research, visited the battlefields in France, she had interviewed former soldiers and researched as much as she could. In fact, she decided to write the novel because a cousin of hers was killed in 1918. None of this was enough for critics who saw no substitute for the trenches. I love this quote from Paul Fussell, and The Great War in Modern Memory is a fantastic book. And Fussell was an incredibly influential person whose book here, this book essentially became very influential in cementing the ideology of combat Gnosticism. And he has this quote where he says, even if those at home had wanted to know the realities of war, they couldn't have without experiencing them. Its conditions were too novel, its industrialized ghastliness too unprecedented. The war would have been simply unbelievable. This idea that it's unbelievable without having seen it makes it seem that there is only one way to acquire this knowledge and this understanding, and that's through personal bodily experience. So this is what happens afterward. The ratio of war novels published by women, it plummets. When you look at the first set of years here, between 1914 and 1923, and 23 is the cutoff because that's the year that Cather receives the Pulitzer Prize. The proportion of women who published these novels was more than 40%. It's 58 of 144 total authors. but immediately afterward, and the total volume of these novels doesn't matter quite so much as the fact that you can see immediately the effect that between 1923 and the end of the Second World War, the proportion dropped to 11%. We're talking about 8 out of 72 authors. And at this point, war fiction becomes a men's domain, and it stays that way for the next 90 years. So then we move on to the Second World War. And again, after that conflict, many soldiers returned with an eye on the literary field. And the major literary development in the first decades after the war was not in style, but it was rather the way that the authority of experience that Fussell had originally talked about became embedded in the emergent creative writing institutions. This is something that I always found to be extremely fascinating, looking into a few of these figures. And essentially, what happens is that building on the foundations of the American fictional response to World War I, the veteran authors who returned from Europe and the Pacific, they saturated the literary landscape with like more than 2,000 novels between 1945 and 1965. Again, the same heroic folks who put together the annotated bibliography for the First World War, they did the same thing for the Second World War. But again, I had to make a cutoff in my research somewhere. I was like, I'm not doing that manually. That's just too many. So I don't have the actual numbers. I don't have the breakdown. And what's really interesting is that the data collection here, and if somebody wants to ask a question about it later, they can. It was brutal, but you also have to ask things like, how do you know whether the author was a veteran or not? Because these annotated bibliographies, they don't tell you that directly. It's not categorized. And then figuring out the gender and stuff, there's a lot of Googling involved and some educated guessing. But most of the case, the World War I data was surprisingly easy to pin down. The World War II data, not so much, interestingly. Anyway, that aside, these creative writing workshops that were founded most famously in Iowa and in Stanford, and a lot of the veterans who were attending, who returned after the war, they received financial support from the government to study at universities, and quite a few chose to attend these workshops. And we can ask ourselves the question, what did they learn there? There are a number of really good books on this subject, but the main thing was this mantra, write what you know, which for those of you who've been involved with fiction writing to some degree have undoubtedly heard this phrase, right? It became just absolutely embedded in the institution. And the motto, again, emphasizes the philosophy that authenticity comes from personal experience. And what's important here is how this became a foundational component of the creative writing classroom. Ernest Hemingway is the model for this philosophy, and his literary works and his statements on war fiction, especially what counts as truth, were more influential than anybody else's. He wrote this quote here, which is, "A writer's job is to tell the truth. His standard of fidelity to the truth should be so high that his invention out of his experience should produce a truer account than anything factual can be." So the combination of write what you know with Hemingway's influence, and by the way, if you want to trace Hemingway's influence on post-World War II soldier writing, they were all reading him. His short stories get taught in every single one of these workshops. They take on this philosophy of combat Gnosticism, and the next 20 years are characterized by this combination of write what you know and Hemingway's philosophy. When you get to Vietnam, there are a number of additional changes that happen, what I refer to as the consolidation of authority. And unlike the veterans of the world wars who wrote novels to convey their experiences to civilians back home, the Vietnam veterans came to believe that the truth of the war was not at all communicable to those who had not been there. This consolidation of authority happened by invoking a kind of rhetoric that valued personal experience over all other forms and sources of knowledge. They reacted against a counterculture movement that viewed soldiers as villains rather than akin to the heroes of World War II. And they actively sought authority over the war's representation as a way to regain control of their image in society. They grabbed onto narratives that painted the war as a unique event in American history, and they combined them with the language of trauma to build a metaphorical fortress around their authority to interpret the war's meaning. And under these conditions, personal experience was no longer the primary source of narrative authority. It was the only source. And many veterans, as you've probably heard the phrase is repeated in jest over the years, they even claim that it's impossible to even understand the war without having been there. And it's no coincidence that Paul Fussell's quote appears at around the same time. That's 1975 we're talking. So it's exactly at this moment that this sort of battle for the authority to control the narrative starts to really take shape. What's fascinating is that while previous generations of veterans may have argued that only those who have seen the war could effectively and authentically convey that experience through mediated representation, there was still an implicit assumption that the truth of that experience could be conveyed. But after the Vietnam War, experience becomes something else entirely. It becomes transcendental, sublime, revelatory, and it's a truth known only to those who were there, a truth that goes beyond representation. So now we can ask ourselves the question, what happened to bring us back to this graph? Everything I've told you for the last, 15 minutes would suggest that there should be no change to the literary representation of war in American fiction. But veterans had almost completely taken control of that narrative authority. But now we look at the numbers and we say the proportion of non-veterans who've written a novel about Iraq, Afghanistan, it contradicts this picture. So to explain this transformation, this is where the interdisciplinary nature of this work comes in. We have to take a closer look at the civil-military relationship. This graph shows that American society has a high level of trust in the military, at least compared to other institutions. The eagle-eyed viewers among you will notice that this is from 2017 and 2018. The diligent researcher that I am, I looked up today to see if this is still accurate, and in fact, it is. The Gallup Confidence in Institution polls continues to show that the military is the, I think, second highest recipient of high trust, behind only small business as of 2023, interestingly enough. But the absolute value has actually dropped. So this top blue line in the graph, which shows the military is no longer above 70%. It's actually dropped by about 10% in the last 5 years, which I think is in and of itself kind of interesting. And of course, in preparing for this discussion today, I went down the rabbit hole of like looking at all the data and stuff. I was like, oh no, I can't do this. I'm not doing this anymore. So we start with this high trust in institutions, but at the same time, since the abolition of the draft in 1973, there has been a kind of alienation or disinterest from civil society toward the military. There's hardly any personal contact between civilians and veterans, and the structural conditions of the professional army military allow most citizens to completely push distant wars and conflicts out of their minds. So in political science, this is called the civil-military gap, probably not a surprising concept to any of you, but it can be understood as an alienation between civil society and the military. And when this alienation is considered alongside the high level of trust as measured in surveys, the situation becomes clear. It's a cultural dissonance. There's disinterest on one hand and high trust on the other. Veterans are thanked for their service, but the gratitude usually ends there. But this raises a complicated point. If only those who've experienced war can understand it, then in an all-volunteer military, only those who choose to serve are condemned to bear the burden of that experience, while the rest of the country carries on. But this is exactly the attitude that contributed to the transformation of war fiction authorship. It's what I call the dispersion of authority. It starts with this as one example of many, where veterans who served in Iraq or Afghanistan explicitly cede their narrative authority. This is an article from 2016 by Matt Gallagher, who on the day that his novel about the Iraq War was published another article called "You Don't Have to Be a Veteran to Write About War." It's pretty straightforward what the argument is here. And in the article itself, he goes on to list a lot of reasons historically and otherwise why non-veterans writing about war is not just a good, not just an okay thing, but it's a thing to encourage. And he himself mentions some of the texts that have become most well known with the Iraq War, so Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk. He also talks about Stephen Crang's Red Badge of Courage, and he talks about Bobby Ann Mason's In Country, which is the novel that I mentioned earlier. This is, in my view, a reaction against the civil-military gap. In a society that has detached itself from the consequences of war, the volunteers have recognized that the Vietnam veterans' attitude toward the literary representation of war is untenable. The new generation of writers no longer claims the sole authority to interpret the wars in fiction. One characteristic of the civil-military gap is the loss of civic responsibility for the consequences of foreign wars. So the veteran author's motivation then corresponds to the desire to share the experience of war and the burden of interpretation with non-veterans, with civilians. This isn't entirely enough, to be fair, to explain the proportion of authorship, keeping in mind that in publishing, agents, editors, and publishers all have a say in what does get published. But this brings us back to the idea and the concept of authenticity. Novels are a product that publishers sell to make a profit, and each genre has its own rules, its own conventions, and signals that publishers use to market books to their readership. And these books have to meet certain expectations. With war novels, we've seen how important the concept of authority and authenticity were throughout the 20th century. So we can assume that publishers only publish novels that they believe to be authentic, or at least to sell as authentic representations. One approach to make this a little bit clearer is historical novels. And yeah, I know these are two films, but they serve the same purpose, right? The idea that sources of narrative authenticity change over time. For an event that occurred outside of living memory, so no one was alive at the time of the event, it becomes irrelevant, aesthetically or otherwise, if an author has no personal experience with the subject of a historical novel. Readers do not judge, nor do critics judge historical novels against standards of authenticity that privilege firsthand experience, but rather against other markers of authenticity conveyed within the text itself. The farther one is in time from the historical events depicted in a novel, the more the ascription of authority is based on these intratextual factors as they correspond with known historiography. In most cases, we're talking about the accuracy of historical detail, proper language use, avoidance of anachronisms, and so on. And as an example, I've got Braveheart up here, right? So the film comes out in 1995, but the events depicted are from the late 13th century. Nobody is checking Braveheart for like personal experience, right? Nobody cares that the filmmakers had no experience in the Wars of Scottish Rebellion. Nobody cares about that. And then you look at something like The Hurt Locker, which was a film that came out in 2009, but the events were from 2004. So this period is shortened. And my argument here is that for America's 20th century wars and their literary history, it was normal for decades to elapse between the end of the war and the regular appearance of historical novels. But for the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, there's been no delay whatsoever. I refer to this as the acceleration of history, where the temporal distance between things that are happening at the moment, and history for what happened in the past, it has collapsed. And in the case of war fiction, it's collapsed into a social distance between the military and society. And the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan were as far from the typical American's frame of daily reference as the wars in Vietnam, or for that matter, the world wars. You can think of the emergence of World War II historical fiction. Nowadays, if somebody writes a novel about World War II, nobody is interrogating it for authenticity or the author's biography. And the same would be true to some extent about Vietnam. It's happened. You can see this in the publication of more and more historical novels about the war, starting in the early 2000s, funny enough. So the idea, what's illustrated by The Hurt Locker here, is that this historical temporal distance is no longer as important as it had been. So just a couple more graphs, because I love graphs and they illustrate my point very, very well. The next two graphs show how the distribution of contemporary war fiction authorship has changed compared to Vietnam. That's kind of my point, right? So if you look here, the ratio of novels published about Vietnam between 1965 and 1985, and these numbers are actually not quite as large as they should be. I later found another source of an annotated bibliography about the Vietnam War, and there were far more novels that were written and published about the Vietnam War than I was able to find in my initial data scrub. But I think the conclusions stay the same because almost all of those were written by veterans, and so the proportion of veteran-authored novels increases, not decreases. Whereas on the right-hand side for Iraq and Afghanistan, this is almost equal, like I mentioned earlier, where you've got, in this case, I've put the veterans and these non-military observers into the same category just because it's based on who was there, who can credibly claim the authority of experience. But it's still pretty much even. And this graph shows the difference in the trend. And then, as I mentioned earlier, this is the proportion of female authored novels about the wars. And again, Vietnam, almost none, almost no novels written by women, veteran or otherwise. There is in fact at least one novel about the Vietnam War published in 1988, and the name is escaping me right now, but it's very cool. I'll have to find out and send it to you all. It was a sci-fi novel. Does anybody know off the top of their head? Elizabeth something. I can't remember it. I'll look it up afterward. But yeah, as I mentioned earlier, the proportion of novels written by women and published about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan significantly higher. So again, there are underlying factors that affect the reception of authenticity within the field. And so now it's no longer this male-dominant, veteran-dominated field, as I had mentioned, that it had been for many years. There's one last wrinkle to all of this that is, in my opinion, very important to kind of bring together everything. I mentioned that public trust in the military remains high, but the literary representations, when you actually dive into these, not just about who wrote them and who published them, but you look at the content. What are they about? What do the characters do? What happens to them? The representation of veterans in these novels is atrociously bad, very negative. The images are not positive at all. There are quite a few stereotypes that get put in, and when you focus on content-wise, the interaction between civilians and veterans in these novels, which occur frequently, and when you focus on them particularly, but not exclusively, those written by non-veterans, you have all these stereotypes, like the people who join the military only do so because they're poor, uneducated, they had no other choice, and they deserved what they got, right? That there's a loss of moral authority that comes with volunteering that is encapsulated in this quote from one of the novels that I read for this at the top is, "You volunteered to get screwed." The idea that somebody got screwed, somebody got traumatized, whatever it is, whatever their experience was, in a way, they deserve it from this perspective because they volunteered for it. Some authors, and this is the most fascinating trend in some of these novels, some authors try to get around that. There's no draft, right? So without the draft, you can't remove the author or the veteran from the consequence of the decision to join the military. So some authors do this by having their characters join the military before 9/11, and then they're like, "Oh, I guess I'm going to war now." They draft them basically through historical consequence. It's kind of funny. It's a really interesting trend. Whereas in the Vietnam novels written about the Vietnam War, quite a few main characters are drafted. It's a big theme, as you might imagine, because there's this credible moral authority that comes with, I didn't want to do this. I was sent there. It wasn't my fault. But what's fascinating is in the same sentence almost as the loss of moral authority, that you volunteered to get screwed, there's a deference to experiential authority, which is always asking veterans, and again, I'm talking about civil military interactions in fiction, in novels. Often civilian characters will ask veterans, are we winning? How's it going? Is the war justified? Should we be there? all these kinds of scenes happen over and over again. So on one hand, the loss of moral authority is complemented by this deference to experiential authority. And my hypothesis, that's kind of borne out by perhaps the decrease in public trust to some degree, is that this type of cognitive dissonance is contributing to an instability in public trust. On one hand, we trust the institution, we trust the military, and yet all the representations are negative. I think that's the last slide, but I have like a summary thing, which is, basically the dispersion of authority over the literary representation of war in American memory culture represents the bookend of a process that began in 1921 and lasted nearly 100 years. The veteran author's accumulation of authority between World War I and Vietnam faced a disruption after the shift to a professional military, and the social gap that has characterized the civil-military relationship has helped reshape the war fiction genre to reflect the changes in American society since the 1970s. From an American studies perspective, what's happening in the genre also runs counter to many of the prevailing norms and trends in American literature, where the notion of speaking for others has encountered increasing resistance. Today, more than a century after the publication of Three Soldiers and the origin of a new genre of American war literature, this philosophy of combat Gnosticism is not as forceful as it once was. The developments that I've discussed here suggest that both veterans and the publishing industry no longer consider war experience a secret knowledge reserved only for an initiated few, but rather that war is accessible to anyone who desires an understanding of it and its consequences for society as a whole. Thank you. The silence is so weird.
Cue all the clapping hands emojis and celebratory confetti. Thank you, David. We will open it up to Q&A. About how long do we have, David?
I have like 30 minutes, if that's okay.
About 30?
Yeah.
Perfect. I will keep track of time.
Thank
Feel
you.
free to jump in if something comes, if you're better at typing than speaking aloud or prefer to type it out. Jim and I can certainly facilitate reading those questions aloud. Larry has a hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Dave. This is very, very interesting and very informative. I know you mentioned this in the beginning about, the fact that we haven't had a war in our country on our soil, essentially since the Civil War. Would you see this as a uniquely American, I don't want to say issue, but a phenomenon of authors because we haven't, versus, let's say, Germany or places in Europe where in fact they did experience war on their soil, or in Asia, parts of Southeast Asia, and other parts where civilians who were living in the war and being part of that, being traumatized by that, they could write and then would have some sort of authority. Is it just kind of what your findings are is just kind of uniquely American?
Yeah, that's a great question. And my hypothesis is that it's uniquely American. I would love to see a follow-up on this that does the comparative literature study that says, what does post World War II German literature look like? And what are the themes there? For example, even British literature post World War I and World War II could be an interesting point of comparison to see, they were close. There were a lot more civilian experiences during World War II of like the Blitz, etc. But the war wasn't actually being fought in their country. And that would be, I think if you were to do a couple of different international comparative literature project. I'm waiting for someone to do it. I won't be the one to do it. It's too much work. But I think I share the feeling that it's a uniquely American way of thinking about the genre. But I can't prove it. And the empiricist in me says I'd love to just read it to find out.
Bruce, I see you had a hand up, but before I saw Latasha shut hers up. Latasha, did you have a question? All right, go ahead, Bruce.
Well, pick up on that point. First, I think the First World War German experience might be the interesting one to compare with the United States. And I'm reading remarks the way back right now. And of course, Germany was not occupied or, a combat zone after the First War, and that plays a large part in the novel. But also in a kind of comparative sense, is the Gnostic authority that you were talking about something that distinguishes war fiction from other genre fictions, as I think about crime fiction or Westerns, both of which have, of course, have lots of veteran stories embedded within them. I don't think you could have a modern American Western if it hadn't been for the Civil War. But is there something peculiar about that Gnostic authority having such potency within war fiction? Because I can't really envision it in the other popular American fiction genres.
Yeah, I think I agree with that completely. And I think there's a very specific subset of literary fiction about the war where this actually matters, where this comes up. Nobody dings Tom Clancy for not having served, right? Nobody cares about that. And I think that when you look at this, if you were to really take a literary scholar's hat for this, you would have to look at how genre conventions are formed and the strength of those conventions when there are resistance. So when something bumps up against them. We see this with the First World War with Dos Passos, where he writes a novel that is unlike anything anyone has ever written before or read before. Arguably, you could say that The Red Badge of Courage is this first realistic type war story. I mean, and there's some Civil War stuff to be noted about it. But when it comes to World War I, pop fiction was a huge deal during the first 20 years of the 20th century. And the fact that there were so many novels where World War I was just like a cool setting for an action story or a romance or whatever shows that the genre didn't really exist in that form. And then all of a sudden we have Dos Passos, and it pushes up against this existing construct, the conform of what the genre looks like. And then all of a sudden things change. I think to look at other genres, to say like the thriller or the spy novel or anything else like that, it would be a really interesting like narrative theory project to figure out how these genres conventions are formed and then how are they broken. And that's a longer answer to the question of I think that it really is something that's unique to the literary fiction genre. Is how is someone who's trying to write a realistic-esque war story, how is that received, and how does that fit into the conventions of that genre as opposed to something like a Western or a crime novel or something where, yeah, tons of veteran characters, but that's not actually the focus of the story. It's not about the war or the veteran. It's about the crime. It's about, the heist, something else. That's, I think, where I would start.
Other questions? Well, I will jump in with one. So I think so much of creative writing privileges the imaginary, right? Innovation and surprise and uniqueness and making something new and original. But what do you think it is about war broadly or combat specifically that somehow excludes it from this sort of privilege of creativity?
I think that it's when you look at it from the pre-Iraq and Afghanistan times, and even actually since then, thinking about the content, I'll say more about that in a second. I think because the idea of war and combat is an experience that exists outside the realm of, let's call it, typical human experience. And that puts it in a place that makes it harder to access for most people from a fictional standpoint. Trauma outside of war is, I think, another really good place for this, because we don't actually care if an author writes a story where a character experiences a particular type of trauma, whether or not the author has experienced that trauma themselves. At least that's how it used to be. I don't actually know. I feel like things are going a little bit in a different direction now, where there's more of a trend to get annoyed with or to criticize authors who are writing about things that they themselves have not experienced or writing from a perspective that they do not actually share. I don't agree with that. I think fiction is for exactly that. I think fiction is meant to explore these ideas and these experiences without having to experience them yourself. The place I was getting to with the current wars is that I don't talk about it in this talk because there's just never enough time for it, but I have an entire chapter in the book that talks about how combat is actually not the main theme, not the dominant theme of most novels of Iraq and Afghanistan. It's coming home. That's the theme, and everybody can relate to that. It doesn't take combat experience to relate to these stories, and I think the fact that, well, one can argue that the veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan, on the whole, experienced significantly less combat, physical combat, compared to previous generations who were on the front lines. Not all of them. It's just not the interesting part of the story anymore, and that's I think what comes out in these novels. You know, there are a couple. Some of the early ones do this a little bit to some extent. I mean, Yellow Birds has a lot of combat in it, but that's not what that book is about, right? Billy Lynn's Long Halftime Walk has one scene, maybe 3 pages of combat total. But again, that's not what that book is about. Redeployment has no combat in it, right? I mean, I'm just naming the first things that come to mind. I'll admit, I read all these books like 7 years ago, so it's been a while. And I don't remember what's in all of them. But there are not too many novels of Iraq and Afghanistan where combat is like the main thing. Spoils a little bit. Brian Van Reed has a bunch. I could do this all day. I could try to remember things. I've got my own book. It's somewhere. I put it back in the shelf. I could have just looked at it, but yeah. Sorry, that was a rambling answer to a good question.
That was great. There's a question in the chat from Shima, and then Jim, I see you have your hand up. Is there any space in this area to discuss the veterans' family members or wounded veterans' caregivers in this literature as novelists due to their unique perspective and experience of war?
Yeah, totally. And that's another, God, I can't remember the English word right now. Adjacent point where this theme comes up a bunch as well in the novels, where family members are major characters, and there's more exploration of the effects of the veterans' actions and homecoming on those around them. So family members play a huge part in quite a few of these novels. Whether or not I missed the second part about, was it somebody got the Healer's War? Yes, that was correct. I just saw it in the chat. Well done. Thank you for helping me. It's a fantastic book. Caregivers, yeah, exactly. So I think that there are some of those, although it's not really caregivers for injured veterans necessarily, but it's more for family members. That's something I ended up cutting from the final version of this because it didn't quite fit. But yeah, how the war and the veterans' homecoming affects those around them is an important theme. So there's definitely space for it.
I want to follow up before Jim jumps in because mine's directly related to that. Do you find, it didn't make the book, but in your experience, I would surmise that in many ways the experiences of the family members' response to the coming home is likely full of as many stereotypes as those of the veterans? Is that something that you found in?
Yeah, totally. Particularly, again, there are 2 kind of companion novels I write about at length in the book. One of them is Roxana Robinson's Sparta, and another is Be Safe, I Love You, whose author's name I can't remember at the moment. Hoffman? Yeah, something like that. And where was I going with that? We were talking about something and I got distracted. Stereotypes, my goodness. Yeah, so in both cases, there are family members who warn against joining the military. Sparta is I like Sparta as a novel, but it has all of the stereotypes you could imagine about the service. They're all in there, and it's really fascinating to see how they play into it. Where the main character's mother even has this like internal monologue of like, I thought only people who couldn't do anything with their lives would join the Marines, which, I mean, to be fair, not wrong, Marines, but Jim, I see you laughing. Thank you. Yeah, John, you too. That was for you guys. And Randy, I know you're laughing too. But yeah, I think that I shouldn't be surprised, but even in some cases, like this, you volunteered to get screwed comes from Jesse Goolsby's book, and he does a very interesting. That's one of my favorite, if not one of the best novels about the entire war that I've read. I'd walk with my friends if I could find them, and he has this fantastic long scene between a veteran and his dad, and the dad was basically like, "What do you expect, bro? This is what you signed up for." And it's fascinating. It doesn't really reflect the same stereotypes that we see in some of these other novels, but it's a way of thinking that, of course, it made me think, why is Jesse, somebody who's done this, giving me this perspective? What am I supposed to take from it? It's a fascinating way of representation.
Jim. And then
So, yeah, so thanks, David. That was fantastic. And I also tried very quickly to get a screenshot of Mariana with the gratuitous, your book right up in the camera, reading it. I didn't get it in time, but we'll figure that out later. So my question really revolves, and I know you're beating around this, like who has responsibility for this? And I'm going to fumble through an analogy and why I'm thinking about this. Just a couple of weeks ago, I saw the movie American Fiction, which then brought me to Percival Everett's book, and this like satire of the business of literature. And I'm wondering what role, the authors are responding to the buyers are responding to the market, which then turns around and drives the author. How, like, can we place some responsibility, can we, I don't even know what my question is, but if you can riff on that a little bit, that would be a interesting take.
This is one of my favorite kind of topics in contemporary cultural studies research, with this authenticity representation, who has the right to do what. I think it's just a fascinating subject. There's a reason that I try to be very careful when I say novels published about the war and not novels written about the war, because we don't know the novels that were not published. We only know the ones that were. And so I allow for the possibility that hundreds of non-veterans wrote novels about the Vietnam War that publishers said, why would anybody read this, and rejected. I think that is a possibility. Not likely, but I think it is possible. And my assumption here is that there's an attempt within a very concentrated group of volunteer veterans who are saying, no, this is all of our responsibility and not just those who served. And I think that cultural conversation has its own effects on how publishers view the subject, because they're not like, I don't think a publisher is necessarily or an agent is caring about this as an issue in general. But if the cultural conversation is shifting, then they're going to be perceptive to that. And if the conversation is, this is all of our responsibility, we all have some say in foreign policy decision making, it's not just those who served, it's not just their burden. And the original title for this whole project was Unburdened, because it was this idea that the civilian population was unburdened from the consequences of the war, while veterans have tried to unburden themselves from that responsibility. My publisher suggested writing wars, and I don't disagree. It's a cool title. So, but the impetus for the whole idea came from this observation. And, again, to kind of riff on this representation thing, I know that there is a cultural trend toward authenticity about who can represent what, but I get really skeptical about that, because after a while it becomes, you can only represent yourself. You can only write about yourself and things that you have seen, and no one can understand it because they're not you. I think that's where this goes in its absurdest possible form. But the responsibility for everybody comes into, I think it's just a conversation. I think it's just doing things like this and having organizations like the VSA that are trying to encourage civil military dialogue I think those things do matter. And eventually there's a business case to say that a publisher who wants to publish a novel about the war will care more about the novel and its content and its aesthetic appreciation than who the author is. It's just so much easier to market a novel about a subject if the author has some relation to the subject. I think it's just that simple.
Thank you. Randy, and then John and Dr. Street, I see your hands. Randy.
Well, and Jim and I were thinking along similar lines from a data collection standpoint, knowing that, and I'm gonna call memoir a genre from a publishing standpoint, given the ascendancy of memoir as a publishing category in the 90s and aughts, how did you correct, or how would you correct, for as a researcher, your selection of, or your definition of, what is literary long form storytelling and publishing? Because I know Matt Gallagher's a novelist, and he will, he's fun to talk to about. The novel is the only way that we can really tell the truth of the story, and those types of religious philosophical conversations. But today's publishing world, with memoir and creative nonfiction kind of taking on that journalistic or the reportage of the wartime experience, how did you, or how would you correct for, okay, if I'm looking only at war novels, there's this other thing going on with veterans and others coming home and telling their first person story to a ghostwriter or maybe themselves, using literary tools, using literary expressions, but it's a different form of it's a different category of publishing. So
Yeah.
Again, how did you, or how would you kind of account for that, I guess, or factor that into?
It's absolutely a great point. And I think the first answer is practical, in the sense that when I was doing this research, we have to admit that the field of literary fiction has a minimal influence on the culture. I mean, if a book sells 10,000 copies, that's wonderful. And that's not nearly as many as the millions who will see a movie or will play Call of Duty or anything else like that. So those, just being real about the impact that these novels have on the culture, is fairly minimal. So I think that the reason why that becomes interesting, though, is that it's a space in which this dialogue is happening. There's a lot of civil military relations policy where people are saying we need to encourage dialogue. And my point to that is that it's happening, but it's happening in the pages of fiction, not necessarily in other places. Memoir is, of course, I think, an important category. Of course, memoir is based on the premise that the author has in fact experienced the thing that they're writing about. And when that doesn't happen, then it's a breach of trust. And that makes the news, right? What was it, the 3 Cups of Tea guy and a few others, where when the memoir comes out and all of a sudden it finds out, oh, this didn't really happen, it's just fiction, people get really pissed if you package fiction as memoir. On the flip side, you have something like Nico Walker's Cherry, which is a really interesting novel, but it's only good because it has the word novel on the cover. It is ostensibly a memoir, right? But you put the word novel on the cover, and it does something to it. It transforms the way you receive it. And now, I don't know, if it came out as a memoir, I mean, there are practical reasons why, he's in jail, so he probably couldn't profit from his own story. But calling it a novel is just fiction, right? It's fine. So I think there are some border cases where this would be a really interesting, like, article level investigation to find out how those are received. But yeah, I think that the memoir as a category, from a practical standpoint, was something that would have been too large to include in this project. And I think that others who I know who are working in this field are trying to do it to a greater extent with more texts.
How did you winnow during your data selection or your set selection? That's what I'm kind of curious as, because there were obviously. Oh,
that's
okay.
the point. Like
all right.
To get a representative sample for all of the post 9/11 novels, I tried to read them all and I tried to capture them all, so I could say, look, this is the trend. It really is representative. For Vietnam, I read a handful, a selection, but then I tried to count the other ones just to do some numerical comparison. That would have been the one thing that I tried to do that I didn't get very far with for a lot of practical reasons was to create a data set of all the novels published from the Vietnam War onwards to really do this comparison numerically. But the data collection is just brutal because there's so much missing information that you would have to fill in. And it's just, you can't find out if a novel that you've never heard of that was published in 1972 was written by a veteran or not. And you can't guess without screwing up your data. So that's why. But for the post 9/11 stuff, I tried to read them all. I don't recommend it.
John.
Yeah, I'm going to continue this theme of genre and publishers. So it actually just to say what Randy was asking about is this book here does a good job of talking about memoir and really get at the addresses the questions that you're having. But David, you mentioned earlier about literary fiction not being read by many people. Except in like MFA programs or PhD programs. So how does the literary fiction compare to the popular representations? And I just read this book here about popular representations of the Vietnam War, the macho pulp adventure magazines. And so I'm wondering just how much of this drive for authenticity that you talk about is these Vietnam veterans who read this crap and were just like, we can't believe that people believe that, well, we believe this stuff going in, we see what the reality is, and now we have to correct. And I'm wondering if this push for authenticity and, demand of authority is that an overcorrection of, that we can't allow, this, popular stuff to be the dominant narrative anymore.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that's exactly what it is. And in fact, in some of these novels, for example, like Royce Granton's War Porn, he actively tries to dismantle this image of the veteran in society, etc. I was so jealous when that book came out. I think Pulp Vietnam came out like pretty close to when I was finishing writing my dissertation, and I was like, this is so good. I'm so annoyed. And he was so thorough, and the quantitative and the qualitative work is it's fantastic. It's good stuff.
Yeah, I just met him the other day. He's here in San Diego.
Is he? Okay.
Yeah.
That's cool. That's really cool.
You might have the last one, sir. Dr. Street, go ahead.
Oh, okay, yeah. I just wanted to mention that I'm actually in the World War II Studies program at Arizona State, and that I was really happy to see that data of military literature that had been written by non-veterans. So I think that was very encouraging, because I would like to write about World War II, being a non-veteran myself. And I also got to think, I wanted to mention that a lot of sports journalists, which is what I have my doctorate in, is sports management. There's a lot of sport journalists who are never professional athletes who do a lot of writing in that space. So I just wanted to mention that to you within that too. So,
oh, that's cool. That's fascinating. I mean, there's some really interesting like philosophy of this, right? Where it comes to a lot of us have played sports, so right. I can imagine what it would take to write about it, but few people have been to war, and therefore the idea of writing about it starts to get a little bit weird and iffy. And that's why you have others who come in and say, no, like, do it. It's great. In fact, the more you try to write about it, the better, because then we can have this conversation. It's not, as Phil Kleist calls it, a failure of the imagination in an op-ed years ago, where he says that saying that you can't understand what a veteran has been through, it just kills the conversation. And I think that is the exact viewpoint that we're trying to avoid. I don't usually, when I talk about this project, I'm one of, there's a number of scholars out there, Scranton among them, and Caleb Cage and a few others, who have published scholarship about this subject. And I think almost all of us have been on the side of, you don't have to be a veteran to write about war. And it makes it somewhat awkward that I am and making this argument. And so I don't ever know really how to navigate that, and saying like, do as I say, not as I do. I think
your presentation was very encouraging. I wanted to tell you that. So.
I'm happy to hear that. I'm really happy to hear that.
We've got about 3 minutes left. If someone
Corinne,
has
there's a question. Yeah, there's a question in the chat, which
Oh, fantastic.
I'll read from Shima.
I already did that,
Oh, you said that one right? Did I miss
Yeah.
it? Oh,
unless Shima's had a second one.
no.
Yeah.
I
Yeah, no,
must-
we talked about that.
I was lost.
Did you
Okay,
fall asleep at the wheel? It's okay.
probably.
All right. Monica, you have a question.
I'll go quickly. It's not real, it's not, we don't have to get into this, but I'm curious how this translates into other communication modalities like podcasts, you know, non-veterans hosting a podcast and talking about war and war stories on the podcast. And I'd be curious what that would look like, you know, if you did the same thing, but went through podcasts of all the years, or, you know, other channels where these stories are told and not just in written writing. I think it'd be interesting.
That would be a really fascinating extension of this to see if the conclusions here extend into other fields as well. I think I would love to find out.
John says he's working on a paper about veteran podcasters right now. Fantastic. Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you, David. Jim, did you have any final words for folks?
Yeah, I will say if this is what we're trying to do with Veteran Studies Association. Thank you very much, David, for your presentation. If you're not a member, check us out online, veteranology.org. We'd love to have you as a member to support this type of work. So we'll see you in a month.
Yeah, absolutely. And a recording of this will be made available on our YouTube channel, so you'll be able to check it out there as well.
Great.
All right.
Thanks
Everybody.
everyone.
Thank you.